An anomaly which often struck me in the character of my friend Sherlock Holmes was that, although in his methods of thought he was the neatest and most methodical of mankind, and although also he affected a certain quiet primness of dress, he was nonetheless in his personal habits one of the most untidy men that ever drove a fellow lodger to distraction. Not that I am in the least conventional in that respect myself. The rough and tumble work in Afghanistan, coming on the top of a natural bohemianism of disposition, has made me rather more lax than befits a medical man. But with me, there is a limit, and when I find a man who keeps his cigars in the coal scuttle, his tobacco in the toe end of a Persian slipper, and his unanswered correspondence transfixed by a jackknife into the very center of his wooden mantelpiece, then I begin to give myself virtuous airs. I have always held, too, that pistol practice should be distinctly an open-air pastime, and when Holmes, in one of his queer humors, would sit in an armchair with his hair trigger and 100 boxer cartridges and proceed to adorn the opposite wall with a patriotic VR, done in bullet pox, I felt strongly that neither the atmosphere nor the appearance of our room was improved by it. Our chambers were always full of chemicals and of criminal relics which had a way of wandering into unlikely positions and of turning up in the butter dish or in even less desirable places. But his papers are my great crux. He had a horror of destroying documents, especially those which were connected with his past cases, and yet it was only once in every year or two that he would muster energy to docket and arrange them. For, as I have mentioned somewhere in these incoherent memoirs, the outbursts of passionate energy when he performed the remarkable feats with which his name is associated were followed by reactions of lethargy, during which he would lie about with his violin and his books, hardly moving save from the sofa to the table. Thus month after month his papers accumulated, until every corner of the room was stacked with bundles of manuscript which were on no account to be burned, and which could not be put away save by their owner. One winter's night, as we sat together by the fire, I ventured to suggest to him that, as he had finished pasting extracts into his commonplace book, he might employ the next 2 hours in making our room a little more habitable. He could not deny the justice of my request, so with a rather rueful face he went off to his bedroom, from which he returned presently pulling a large tin box behind him. This he placed in the middle of the floor, and, squatting down upon a stool in front of it, he threw back the lid. I could see that it was already a third full of bundles of paper tied up with red tape in separate packages.
"There are cases enough here, Watson,"
said Sherlock, looking at me with mischievous eyes.
"I think that if you knew all that I had in this box, you would ask me to pull some out instead of putting others in."
These are the records of your early work. Then, I have often wished that I had notes of those cases.
"Yes, my boy. These were all done prematurely before my biographer had come to glorify me."
He lifted bundle after bundle in a tender, caressing sort of way.
"They are not all successes, Watson, but there are some pretty little problems among them. Here's the record of the Tarleton murders, and the case of Vanbury, the wine merchant, and the adventure of the old Russian woman, and the singular affair of the aluminium crutch, as well as a full account of Ricoletti of the clubfoot, and his abominable wife. And here, now, this really is something a little recherche."
He dived his arm down to the bottom of the chest and brought up a small wooden box with a sliding lid, such as children's toys are kept in. From within he produced a crumpled piece of paper, an old-fashioned brass key, a peg of wood with a ball of string attached to it, and 3 rusty old discs of metal.
"Well, my boy, what do you make of this lot?"
It is a curious collection.
"Very curious, and the story that hangs round it will strike you as being more curious still."
These relics have a history then?
"So much so that they are history."
What do you mean by that? Sherlock Holmes picked them up one by one and laid them along the edge of the table. Then he reseated himself in his chair and looked them over with a gleam of satisfaction in his eyes.
"These are all that I have left to remind me of the adventure of the Musgrave Ritual."
I had heard him mention the case more than once, though I had never been able to gather the details. I said, "I should be so glad if you would give me an account of it."
"And leave the litter as it is? Your tidiness won't bear much strain after all, Watson. But I should be glad that you should add this case to your annals, for there are points in it which make it quite unique in the criminal records of this or, I believe, of any other country. A collection of my trifling achievements would certainly be incomplete, which contained no account of this very singular business. You may remember how the affair of the Gloria Scott and my conversation with the unhappy man whose fate I told you of first turned my attention in the direction of the profession which has become my life's work. You see me now when my name has become known far and wide, and when I am generally recognized both by the public and by the official force as being a final court of appeal in doubtful cases. Even when you knew me first, at the time of the affair which you have commemorated in a study in scarlet, I had already established a considerable, though not a very lucrative, connection. You can hardly realize, then, how difficult I found it at first, and how long I had to wait before I succeeded in making any headway. When I first came up to London, I had rooms in Montague Street, just round the corner from the British Museum, and there I waited, filling in my too abundant leisure time by studying all those branches of science which might make me more efficient. Now and again cases came in my way, principally through the introduction of old fellow students, for during my last years at the university, there was a good deal of talk there about myself and my methods. The third of these cases was that of the Musgrave Ritual, and it is to the interest which was aroused by that singular chain of events and the large issues which proved to be at stake that I traced my first stride towards the position which I now hold. Reginald Musgrave had been in the same college as myself, and I had some slight acquaintance with him. He was not generally popular among the undergraduates, though it always seemed to me that what was set down as pride was really an attempt to cover extreme natural diffidence. In appearance, he was a man of exceedingly aristocratic type, thin, high-nosed, and large-eyed, with languid and yet courtly manners. He was indeed a scion of one of the very oldest families in the kingdom, though his branch was a cadet one which had separated from the northern Musgraves some time in the 16th century, and had established itself in western Sussex, where the manor house of Holstone is perhaps the oldest inhabited building in the county. Something of his birthplace seemed to cling to the man, and I never looked at his pale, keen face or the poise of his head without associating him with gray archways and mullioned windows and all the venerable wreckage of a feudal keep. Once or twice we drifted into talk, and I can remember that more than once he expressed a keen interest in my methods of observation and inference. For 4 years I had seen nothing of him until one morning he walked into my room in Montague Street. He had changed little, was dressed like a young man of fashion. He was always a bit of a dandy, and preserved the same quiet, suave manner which had formerly distinguished him. "How has all gone with you, Musgrave?" I asked, after we had cordially shaken hands. He told me that his father had passed away about 2 years earlier, and that since then, he had been busy managing the Holstone estate. As a member of Parliament for his district, his responsibilities had grown manifold. Despite the workload, he had evidently heard of my work and remarked how I was now putting to practical use those same methods of deduction that used to astonish our fellow students. I replied lightly that I had taken to living by my wits, at which he expressed pleasure and confessed that he had a matter at hand where my insight might prove invaluable. According to him, some very unusual events had been taking place at Holstone, incidents that had left the local police completely baffled. He insisted it was a case so bizarre and inexplicable that he felt compelled to seek my help. You can imagine, Watson, how eagerly I listened. After so many months of inaction and quiet waiting, here was the very challenge I had been longing for, a true test of my abilities, and an opportunity to prove that my methods could succeed where conventional efforts had failed. I urged him at once to provide the details. He took a seat opposite me and accepted the cigarette I offered. Then he began by explaining that although he was a bachelor, the sheer size and complexity of the Holstone estate required a large household staff. He maintained 8 maids, a cook, 2 footmen, a boy, and a butler, Brunton, who had been in their service the longest. In addition to them, the garden and stable staffs were managed separately. Brunton, he told me, had originally been a young schoolmaster who'd fallen on hard times. Musgrave's father had taken him in, and over the years, Brunton had become an indispensable part of the household. He was a striking figure, tall, with an impressive forehead, gifted with languages and music. Musgrave seemed genuinely puzzled that such a man, with so many talents, had remained content in the role of a butler for so long. But he supposed the man had found comfort in his position and had perhaps lacked the ambition to change. "Guests at Holstone," he said, always remembered the butler. Musgrave then went on to describe a rather delicate problem within his household. Despite Brunton's many virtues, it appeared the man had one undeniable flaw. He was something of a Don Juan. And in a quiet country estate like Holstone, that role was not difficult to play. During his marriage, things had remained under control. But ever since becoming a widower, Brunton had caused more than one stir. Some months earlier, Musgrave had hoped the man might settle down again. He had become engaged to Rachel Howells, the second housemaid. But before long, Brunton abandoned her and turned his attention to Janet Tregellis, the gamekeeper's daughter. Rachel, though a well-meaning and decent girl, had a passionate Welsh temperament, and the emotional blow had driven her into a sharp spell of brain fever. She had since wandered the house, like a haunted version of her former self. That had been the first of Holstone's recent dramas. But what followed would cast a deeper shadow, a scandal that began with Brunton's disgrace and eventual dismissal. As Musgrave explained, Brunton's intelligence had become his downfall. It had sparked in him an insatiable curiosity for matters that didn't concern him. Musgrave hadn't realized the extent of this inquisitiveness until one seemingly trivial incident revealed the truth. It had happened just a week earlier, on a Thursday night. Musgrave had trouble sleeping, having unwisely taken a cup of strong café noir after dinner. By 2 a.m, he gave up trying to rest, lit a candle, and decided to resume the novel he'd been reading. Remembering the book had been left in the billiard room, he slipped into his dressing gown and made his way downstairs. To reach the billiard room, he had to cross a corridor leading to the library and gun room. To his astonishment, a faint light was glowing from the library's open door, a room he distinctly remembered shutting down himself for the night. Suspecting burglars, he grabbed a battle axe from the wall, one of the many antique weapons decorating the passage, and crept silently down the hallway. Peeking into the room, he found Brunton seated comfortably in an armchair, fully dressed and deep in thought. A small slip of paper, resembling a map, rested on his knee. A taper on the table gave off just enough light to reveal the scene. Musgrave remained still, hidden in the dark, watching as Brunton rose, walked to a side bureau, and drew out a drawer. From it, he retrieved another document, returned to the table, and began studying it intently. At that point, Musgrave's patience snapped. He stepped forward and confronted Brunton, who leapt up in panic, his face drained of color. In a desperate motion, he tucked the original chart-like paper into his coat. Musgrave told him sternly that his betrayal of trust would not be tolerated and that he would be dismissed the next day. Brunton, crushed and silent, bowed and slipped past him. Out of curiosity, Musgrave looked at the second paper Brunton had pulled from the bureau. To his surprise, it was merely a copy of the old family ritual known as the Musgrave Ritual, a traditional set of questions and answers that each Musgrave went through upon reaching adulthood. Of interest to an antiquarian perhaps, but certainly not something of great value. I interrupted to suggest we return to the ritual details later, and Musgrave agreed, albeit reluctantly. But there was more to the night. As he prepared to leave the library, locking the bureau with the key Brunton had left behind, Musgrave turned to find the butler had returned. Overcome with emotion, Brunton begged not to be publicly disgraced. He claimed that dishonor would destroy him and pleaded to be allowed to resign quietly, asking to stay for at least a month to save face. Musgrave, though angry, was not without compassion. A month, however, seemed too long. He offered the man a week, suggesting he could give any reason for his departure. Brunton, devastated, asked for a fortnight, but Musgrave held firm. A week, no more. The butler left, his posture collapsed and his face downcast. Musgrave extinguished the light and returned to his room, the mystery of Brunton's actions still heavy on his mind. For 2 days after the confrontation, Brunton had been unusually attentive to his duties. Musgrave said he didn't speak a word about the incident and waited with quiet curiosity to see how Brunton would carry himself through the disgrace. But on the 3rd morning, things took a strange turn. Brunton failed to show up after breakfast, as he always did, to receive Musgrave's instructions for the day. On his way out of the dining room, Musgrave encountered Rachel Howells, the housemaid Brunton had once been engaged to. She still looked pale and fragile from her recent illness, and Musgrave gently scolded her for working before fully recovering. He told her to return to bed and promised to consult the doctor. Then, almost as an afterthought, he asked her to inform Brunton that he wished to see him. That's when everything took a dramatic turn. Rachel looked at him with a strange, vacant expression and quietly said, "The butler is gone." Naturally, Musgrave was stunned. Gone? Gone where? He is gone. No one has seen him. He is not in his room. Oh yes, he is gone, he is gone. Then, to his horror, the girl collapsed against the wall, overcome with hysterical laughter. Her shrieks echoed through the corridor. Musgrave quickly rang the bell, and she was carried off to her room, still crying and screaming. The search for Brunton began immediately. His bed hadn't been slept in. No one had seen him since he retired the night before. Strangely, all the doors and windows were still locked that morning. Even more baffling, his clothes, his watch, and his money were all still in his room. The only things missing were his black suit and his slippers. His boots were left behind. It made no sense. Where could he have gone, dressed like that, and without his belongings? The entire house was searched, from cellar to attic. Hullstone, with its rambling, half-abandoned old wing, was practically a maze, but they found no sign of the missing man. The police were called, but they fared no better. It had rained the previous night, so Musgrave had hoped to find some clue outside, but the lawn and the paths yielded nothing. Then, just as the household was still reeling from Brunton's disappearance, a second mystery stole their attention. Rachel's health had worsened. She was now so sick, sometimes delirious, sometimes hysterical, that a nurse had been appointed to watch her through the night. On the third night after Brunton vanished, the nurse, finding Rachel fast asleep, dozed off in her chair. She awoke early the next morning to discover the bed empty, the window open, and Rachel gone. Musgrave was roused at once and, with the help of 2 footmen, began searching. It wasn't difficult to track her. Her bare footprints led from beneath her window, across the lawn, straight to the edge of the mere, a small lake on the estate. The trail stopped right at the water's edge. The lake was 8 feet deep. You can imagine Musgrave's dread as he realized what that meant. They sent for drags immediately, prepared to recover the poor girl's body. But instead of Rachel, they pulled from the water a linen bag. Inside it was an odd collection, chunks of rusted, discolored metal and a few dull, colored stones that might have once been pebbles or glass. That strange bundle was the only thing they recovered. Despite more searches and inquiries the following day, there was still no trace of either Rachel Howells or Richard Brunton. "The county police," said Musgrave, "are completely baffled, and so I've come to you, Holmes, as my last hope." You can imagine, Watson, with what eagerness I listened to this extraordinary sequence of events and endeavored to piece them together and to devise some common thread upon which they might all hang. The butler was gone. The maid was gone. The maid had loved the butler, but had afterwards had cause to hate him. She was of Welsh blood, fiery and passionate. She had been terribly excited immediately after his disappearance. She had flung into the lake a bag containing some curious contents. These were all factors which had to be taken into consideration, and yet none of them got quite to the heart of the matter. What was the starting point of this chain of events? There lay the end of this tangled line. I told Musgrave I had to see the paper that Brunton found so important, even at the risk of losing his job. He called it rather an absurd tradition, the Musgrave Ritual, but admitted that it at least had the dignity of age. When Musgrave handed me the paper, I found it to be a series of cryptic questions and answers, clearly ancient, yet brimming with hidden meaning. Let me read them out to you, Watson, along with how I began to interpret them. Whose was it? His who is gone. That suggested it once belonged to someone long dead, perhaps a king, a nobleman, or someone whose legacy was hidden. Who shall have it? He who will come. Not someone of the present, but someone expected a rightful heir perhaps, or one destined to find it. Where was the sun? Over the oak. That seemed to indicate a specific time of day, using the position of the sun as a natural clock, and the oak being a known landmark. Where was the shadow? Under the elm. This answered where the shadow of the oak tree fell. Under the elm, another key marker in the landscape. How is it stepped? North by 10 and by 10, east by 5 and by 5, south by 2 and by 2, west by 1 and by 1, and so under. This was clearly a set of measured steps, like following a hidden path, perhaps a literal guide for walking out a location on the estate grounds. What shall we give for it? All that is ours. That line was dramatic. It hinted that whatever it was of such value that one would give up everything for it. Why should we give it? For the sake of the trust. It wasn't just about personal gain. This was a duty, a responsibility passed down generations, hidden within this archaic ritual. At first glance, Watson, it seemed like poetic nonsense, but I realized Brunton must have seen what I saw, an ancient set of directions, veiled as a family ceremony. And once that struck me, I knew we had to go to Sussex and examine the estate itself. Only there could these landmarks and measurements take on real meaning. Musgrave remarked that the original bore no date, but was written in 17th century spelling. He doubted it could help solve the mystery. But I thought otherwise. To me, Watson, it offered a second, deeper mystery, one which might illuminate the first. I told Musgrave that, in my opinion, Brunton had been a cleverer man than many of his masters. He must have seen this paper before and likely revisited it only to refresh his memory. Musgrave agreed. It had never been kept secret. And indeed, Brunton had been comparing it with some sort of map or chart when he was caught. Now the question was, what did Brunton see in this absurd ritual that others had missed? I told Musgrave that the best course was clear. We should take the first train to Sussex and investigate it directly, on the spot. The same afternoon saw us both at Holstone. Possibly you have seen pictures and read descriptions of the famous old building, so I will confine my account of it to saying that it is built in the shape of an L, the long arm being the more modern portion, and the shorter the ancient nucleus, from which the other had developed. Over the low, heavily linteled door, in the center of this old part, is chiseled the date, 1607, but experts are agreed that the beams and stonework are really much older than this. The enormously thick walls and tiny windows of this part had in the last century driven the family into building the new wing, and the old one was used now as a storehouse and a cellar, when it was used at all. A splendid park with fine old timber surrounds the house, and the lake, to which my client had referred, lay close to the avenue, about 200 yards from the building. I was already firmly convinced, Watson, that there were not three separate mysteries here, but one only, and that if I could read the Musgrave Ritual aright, I should hold in my hand the clue which would lead me to the truth concerning both the butler Brunton and the maid Howells. To that then I turned all my energies. Why should this servant be so anxious to master this old formula? Evidently, because he saw something in it which had escaped all those generations of country squires, and from which he expected some personal advantage. What was it then, and how had it affected his fate? It was perfectly obvious to me, on reading the ritual, that the measurements must refer to some spot to which the rest of the document alluded, and that if we could find that spot, we should be in a fair way towards finding what the secret was which the old Musgraves had thought it necessary to embalm in so curious a fashion. There were two guides given us to start with, an oak and an elm. As to the oak, there could be no question at all. Right in front of the house, upon the left-hand side of the drive, there stood a patriarch among oaks, one of the most magnificent trees that I have ever seen. That same afternoon, we arrived at Holstone. Now, Watson, you may have seen pictures or read accounts of the famed estate, so I won't dwell much on its appearance. I'll only note that the house is built in the shape of an L, the longer arm being the newer addition, while the shorter segment remains the ancient heart of the structure. Above the low, heavy linteled doorway at the center of the old wing, the date 1607 is carved. But, according to architectural experts, the beams and stones are in fact far older. The walls are enormously thick, and the tiny windows of the original wing had proved too inconvenient, pushing the family to construct the newer portion in the previous century. The old part was now used mainly as a storage area or cellar, if it was used at all. The estate was surrounded by a grand park with ancient trees, and the lake mentioned by my client lay just off the main avenue, roughly 200 yards from the house. At this point, I was convinced, Watson, that there weren't three separate puzzles here, Only one. I believed that if I could correctly interpret the Musgrave Ritual, I would uncover the key to both Brunton's disappearance and the fate of the maid, Howells. That document became my full focus. It seemed clear to me that Brunton had found something in the ritual that had eluded generations of Musgraves, and he believed it would bring him personal gain. The question was, what had he discovered, and how had it sealed his fate? Upon rereading the ritual, it was evident that the measurements referred to a specific location hinted at within the text. If I could pinpoint that spot, I would likely uncover the Musgraves' long-guarded secret. The directions began with two landmarks, an oak and an elm. The oak, thankfully, was unmistakable. Right in front of the house, on the left-hand side of the drive, stood a massive ancient tree, one of the grandest oaks I've ever seen. When we drove past it, I noted that it must have existed since the ritual was originally written. My client confirmed this belief, explaining that the tree likely dated back to the Norman conquest and had a girth of 23 feet. As for the elm, things were more complicated. There had once been a very old elm nearby, but it had been struck by lightning a decade earlier and reduced to a stump, which had been removed. However, the exact spot where it had stood was still clearly visible, nearly halfway between the house and the oak. Encouraged by this, I asked about its height. To my surprise, my client was able to tell me immediately. It had been 64 feet tall. Apparently, during his youth, his tutor used trigonometry exercises to calculate the height of all the trees and buildings on the estate. That piece of data was a remarkable stroke of luck. When I asked if Brunton had ever shown interest in the tree's height, my client, after thinking for a moment, recalled that the butler had indeed inquired about it several months earlier during a casual disagreement with the groom. That confirmed to me I was on the right track. I glanced up at the sun and noted it was nearing the top of the oak. I realized that in less than an hour it would be perfectly aligned above the tree's upper branches, just as the ritual described. According to the text, the shadow of the elm was to be used, not the trunk, but the tip of the shadow, which meant I needed to calculate where the end of that shadow would fall when the sun reached the designated position. Now, you might wonder how I managed that, given that the elm was gone, but I reasoned that if Brunton could determine it, so could I. I accompanied my client to his study, where I carved a small peg and tied a long string to it, with knots at every yard. Then I grabbed two sections of a fishing rod. Together they measured exactly 6 feet. Back at the site of the old elm, with the sun just grazing the oak's top, I planted the 6-foot rod upright and traced the shadow's direction. It stretched precisely 9 feet. The rest was a matter of simple proportion. If a 6-foot rod cast a 9-foot shadow, then a 64-foot tree would cast one of 96 feet. Following that line, I measured out the distance, which brought me near the house wall. There, I drove my peg into the ground, and to my delight, I discovered a shallow, conical depression less than 2 inches from my marker. Clearly, it was where Brunton had once measured. I knew I was still following his exact path. Using my pocket compass to establish the cardinal directions, I began stepping from this point. 10 steps parallel to the wall brought me to a new position, which I marked. Then I moved 5 paces east and 2 to the south. That led me right to the threshold of the old door. The ritual next instructed me to take 2 steps west. I entered the stone-flagged passage and counted 2 paces. This was the spot the ritual had described. But Watson, what a crushing wave of disappointment came over me. The sun poured in from behind, lighting the entire passageway. The worn, ancient stones underfoot were solidly set and untouched for decades. I tapped the floor, listened for any hollow sounds, but there was nothing, not even a hint of a disturbance. Clearly, Brunton hadn't worked here. Just as I began to suspect a flaw in my calculations, my client, who had been closely following my steps and had grown quite animated, pulled out the ritual manuscript and examined it again. That's when he spotted a crucial detail I had overlooked. He pointed out the words "and under." I had dismissed them earlier, thinking they simply meant we were to dig, but now I realized what they truly implied. I asked if there was a cellar beneath the passage. He confirmed there was, an old chamber as ancient as the house itself, and he led me directly to the door. We went down a winding stone stair, and my companion, striking a match, lit a large lantern which stood on a barrel in the corner. In an instant it was obvious that we had at last come upon the true place, and that we had not been the only people to visit the spot recently. It had been used for the storage of wood, but the billets, which had evidently been littered over the floor, were now piled at the sides, so as to leave a clear space in the middle. In this space lay a large and heavy flagstone with a rusted iron ring in the center to which a thick shepherd's check muffler was attached. My companion recognized it instantly. It belonged to Brunton. At my suggestion, a couple of the county police were summoned to be present, and I then endeavored to raise the stone by pulling on the cravat. I could only move it slightly, and it was with the aid of one of the constables that I succeeded at last in carrying it to one side. A black hole yawned beneath, into which we all peered, while Musgrave, kneeling at the side, pushed down the lantern. A small chamber about 7 feet deep and 4 feet square lay open to us. At one side of this was a squat, brass-bound wooden box, the lid of which was hinged upwards, with this curious old-fashioned key projecting from the lock. It was furred outside by a thick layer of dust, and damp and worms had eaten through the wood, so that a crop of livid fungi was growing on the inside of it. Several discs of metal, old coins apparently, such as I hold here, were scattered over the bottom of the box, but it contained nothing else. At the moment, however, we had no thought for the old chest, for our eyes were riveted upon that which crouched beside it. It was the figure of a man, clad in a suit of black, who squatted down upon his hams, with his forehead sunk upon the edge of the box, and his 2 arms thrown out on each side of it. The attitude had drawn all the stagnant blood to the face, and no man could have recognized that distorted liver-colored countenance. But his height, his dress, and his hair were all sufficient to show my client, when we had drawn the body up, that it was indeed his missing butler. He had been dead some days, but there was no wound or bruise upon his person to show how he had met his dreadful end. When his body had been carried from the cellar, we found ourselves still confronted with a problem which was almost as formidable as that with which we had started. I confess that so far, Watson, I had been disappointed in my investigation. I had reckoned upon solving the matter when once I had found the place referred to in the ritual, but now I was there, and was apparently as far as ever from knowing what it was which the family had concealed with such elaborate precautions. It is true that I had thrown a light upon the fate of Brunton, but now I had to ascertain how that fate had come upon him, and what part had been played in the matter by the woman who had disappeared. I sat down upon a keg in the corner and thought the whole matter carefully over. You know my methods in such cases, Watson. I put myself in the man's place, and, having first gauged his intelligence, I try to imagine how I should myself have proceeded under the same circumstances. In this case, the matter was simplified by Brunton's intelligence being quite first-rate, so that it was unnecessary to make any allowance for the personal equation, as the astronomers have dubbed it. He knew that something valuable was concealed. He had spotted the place. He found that the stone which covered it was just too heavy for a man to move unaided. What would he do next? He could not get help from outside, even if he had someone whom he could trust, without the unbarring of doors and considerable risk of detection. It was better, if he could, to have his helpmate inside the house. But whom could he ask? This girl had been devoted to him. A man always finds it hard to realize that he may have finally lost a woman's love, however badly he may have treated her. He would try by a few attentions to make his peace with the girl Howells, and then would engage her as his accomplice. Together, they would come at night to the cellar, and their united force would suffice to raise the stone. So far I could follow their actions as if I had actually seen them. But for 2 of them, and one a woman, it must have been heavy work the raising of that stone. A burly Sussex policeman, and I had found it no light job. What would they do to assist them? Probably what I should have done myself. I rose and examined carefully the different billets of wood which were scattered round the floor. Almost at once I came upon what I expected. One piece, about 3 feet in length, had a very marked indentation at one end, while several were flattened at the sides, as if they had been compressed by some considerable weight. Evidently, as they had dragged the stone up, they had thrust the chunks of wood into the chink, until at last, when the opening was large enough to crawl through, they would hold it open by a billet placed lengthwise, which might very well become indented at the lower end, since the whole weight of the stone would press it down on to the edge of this other slab. So far I was still on safe ground. And now how was I to proceed to reconstruct this midnight drama? Clearly, only one could fit into the hole, and that one was Brunton. The girl must have waited above. Brunton then unlocked the box, handed up the contents presumably, since they were not to be found. And then what happened? What smoldering fire of vengeance had suddenly sprung into flame in this passionate Celtic woman's soul when she saw the man who had wronged her, perhaps, far more than we suspected in her power? Was it a chance that the wood had slipped, and that the stone had shut Brunton into what had become his sepulchre? Had she only been guilty of silence as to his fate? Or had some sudden blow from her hand dashed the support away and sent the slab crashing down into its place? Be that as it might, I seemed to see that woman's figure still clutching at her treasure trove and flying wildly up the winding stair, with her ears ringing perhaps with the muffled screams from behind her and with the drumming of frenzied hands against the slab of stone which was choking her faithless lover's life out. Here was the secret of her blanched face, her shaken nerves, her peals of hysterical laughter on the next morning. But what had been in the box? What had she done with that? Of course, it must have been the old metal and pebbles which my client had dragged from the mere. She had thrown them in there at the first opportunity to remove the last trace of her crime. For 20 minutes I had sat motionless, thinking the matter out. Musgrave still stood with a very pale face, swinging his lantern and peering down into the hole. I must have sat motionless for 20 minutes, Watson, thinking it all through. Musgrave stood nearby, face pale, gently swinging the lantern and peering down into the black hole beneath us. Then he held out a few of the coins from the box and remarked that they were from the reign of Charles I. That, he said, confirmed we had placed the date of the ritual correctly. But at that moment, the deeper meaning of the first two lines of that ritual struck me with sudden force. I called out that perhaps we might discover something else, something more significant, related to Charles I. I asked him to show me the contents of the bag he had retrieved from the pond. We returned to his study. There he laid the contents before me. Scraps of metal, dulled and darkened with age, and stones so lusterless they seemed of little worth. No wonder he had thought them insignificant. But when I rubbed one of the stones on my sleeve, it suddenly glowed, like a hidden spark awakened in the hollow of my hand. The metalwork was fashioned into a double ring, though bent and misshapen from time and pressure. It was then that I reminded Musgrave of something he might have overlooked, that even after the execution of Charles I, the royalist cause still lingered in England. When they fled, many loyalists likely buried their treasures, hoping to reclaim them in better days. He told me then that one of his ancestors, Sir Ralph Musgrave, had been a staunch cavalier, close to Charles II during his years of hiding and wandering. I nodded. That connection, I told him, gave us the final missing piece. I congratulated him, though under tragic circumstances, for reclaiming something of immense value, not just in gold or jewels, but as a relic of deep historical significance. When he asked me in disbelief what it was, I told him it was nothing less than the ancient crown of the kings of England. He gasped, "The crown?" I confirmed it. Exactly. Remember what the ritual says. Whose was it? His who is gone. That refers to Charles I after his execution. And who shall have it? He who will come. That's Charles II. There can be little doubt in my mind, Watson, that this battered, misshapen thing once sat on the head of a Stuart king. Musgrave then asked the natural question, how did the crown end up in the pond? That, I told him, would take some explaining. And so, I laid out the entire chain of thought and evidence I had pieced together, from the interpretation of the ritual, to Brunton's scheme, to Rachel Howell's role. It was twilight when I began, and the moon was high and bright before I finished. Finally, Musgrave wondered aloud, if the crown was so important, why hadn't Charles reclaimed it after the Restoration? And to that, Watson, I had to admit, we may never truly know. Perhaps the Musgrave entrusted with its secret died unexpectedly and failed to pass on its meaning. From that time onward, the words of the ritual had been handed down blindly from one generation to the next until it finally came into the hands of a man clever enough to unlock its meaning, but not wise enough to survive the consequences. And that's the story of the Musgrave Ritual, Watson. They have the crown down at Holstone, though they had some legal bother and a considerable sum to pay before they were allowed to retain it. I am sure that if you mentioned my name, they would be happy to show it to you. Of the woman, nothing was ever heard, and the probability is that she got away out of England and carried herself and the memory of her crime to some land beyond the seas.